Good afternoon and welcome to the 2021 Virtual Public Policy Forum of the Francis Perkins Center. This year's program is Conscience and Courage, Little Known Heroes Who Saved Lives. I am Michael Cheney, Executive Director of the Francis Perkins Center, an organization devoted to the life and legacy of Francis Perkins and her commitment to social justice and economic security. Thank you all for joining us today, and special thanks to our program sponsors who helped make this virtual event possible. It is my pleasure to introduce Sarah Peskin, Chair of the Francis Perkins Center Board, who will tell you more about the program. Sarah?
Thank you so much, Michael. And welcome to all our participants from around the world. We're going to hear today from two distinguished speakers, our keynoters, Batami Zucker and Manli Ho, and our moderator, Judy Goldstein, who will address our topic today, Unsung Heroes Who Saved Lives, Francis Perkins and Feng Ho. As we planned this forum on these two quiet diplomatic heroes, we sought to bring to light their stories as we reflect on our nation's history of immigration and refugee policy. We welcome your questions, which you can pose during or after the keynote presentations. To assist moderator Judy Goldstein, Hannah Joy Sachs of Humanity in Action will now explain how to do the chat. Hannah?
Yes, thank you very much. As I think some of you have already figured out, you can access the chat right under the video screen. There will be a place for you to enter your name and accept the terms and conditions, and then you'll be in the chat. Additionally, right where you see the video, in the bottom right corner, right near where it says Vimeo, you'll see a four-way arrow, and if you press that, it will allow you to enter full screen for the video. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. That didn't sound all that difficult. A few weeks ago, we filmed Manli Ho in San Francisco, one of the many places she grew up as the daughter of diplomat Feng Ho. Drawing on her experience as an investigative journalist for the Boston Globe and as a founder of China Daily, China's national English language newspaper, she sought for the past 20 years to uncover the true story of her father's courageous actions that saved countless lives. And now we'll see her interview.
My father, Dr. Feng Ho, was a career diplomat who was posted to Vienna, Austria, to the Chinese legation there in 1937. In Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, Mark Antony says, "The evil that men do lives after them, the good is often interred with their bones." And that would have happened with my father. And that would have happened because the history of that very brief period, 1938 to 1940, where Jews managed to escape the Holocaust, really did not come into light until nearly 60 decades later. After my father's death, I embarked on this odyssey to try to uncover this history and to try to answer some questions. I think the most interesting of which is, how did 18,000 European Jews end up in Shanghai, China? And the answer to that is because it was my father who put Shanghai on the map as a refuge of last resort for them. 1 year into his posting, Germany and Austria merged. It was called the Anschluss, and Austria no longer was a country. The Anschluss ended up being the catalyst then to a refugee crisis, because as soon as Austria became part of Germany, Hitler dispatched his lieutenant, Adolf Eichmann, which later was the architect of the final solution, essentially what he did was he bureaucratized this procedure of getting rid of Jews. That created a frantic and desperate race by the Jewish community to try to get out. And it was not helped by the Evian Conference in July of 1938, where the 32 participating countries, including the United States, decided that they would not take in Jewish refugees. Those were the circumstances that my father witnessed in 1938. He could not bear to stand by. And so he was trying to come up with a means to help the Jews, to try to save them. However, unlike his fellow diplomats, he was faced with a dilemma that none of them would have. The first dilemma was that his country had been invaded and occupied by the Japanese in 1937. So essentially there were no points of access that the Chinese had any control over. And as a diplomat, his only instrument was to issue an entry visa into China, which of course none of the Japanese occupiers would recognize. The second problem that he faced was that his home government had had long-standing relations with Germany. These were economic relations. And in 1938, they realized suddenly that Hitler had turned to the Japanese as an ally. They would later form the Axis alliance. But Hitler was contemptuous of the Chinese, and because they had been occupied by the Japanese, and so he was now turning to the Japanese and was thus breaking some of the contracts that he had with the Chinese. So the Chinese, in desperation, were trying desperately to salvage these economic relations, and therefore did not want anybody, especially my father or any of their diplomats, to do anything that would be seen as contrary to Hitler's policies. So those were the two obstacles that my father faced. And he essentially did what his role model, which was the ancient Chinese tactician Zucker from the Three Kingdoms period, which is 100 to 200 AD, did, which was to come up with some sort of strategy where he could bypass these obstacles to save Jews. So the only place in China that was possibly accessible was the port city of Shanghai. And the reason for that was because after the Japanese invasion of China in 1937, they took over Shanghai, but only the Chinese parts of the city. Shanghai was a semi-colonialized city. So when the Japanese took over Shanghai, the harbor authorities, who were Chinese, fled. And so the harbor was left completely unmanned and completely open, and the other imperial powers did not want the Japanese to take over the harbor because it would be inconvenient for them. So there was nobody in the harbor. You could just land, and without showing passport, without visa, without any papers, you could land and get into Shanghai. So my father chose that as the destination for the entry visas that he issued. My father's visas were obviously not good for entry into China, but they had very many other uses. The first was they provided what the Nazis called proof of immigration in order to get out. So if you had a Shanghai visa, the Nazis would let you out of concentration camp, and they would let you out of the country. I mean, as long as you had that document, you were free to go. The other use of the visa was that it had an end destination, Shanghai. And so you could use that end destination and go to the consulate of another country and say, please issue me a transit visa so that I can pass through your country on the way to my destination. Well, of course, what would happen is, like Arthur Kurteman, who ended up, after being released from Dachau in England, he went immediately to the American embassy and said, I want to apply for immigration to the U.S. because, unlike other countries where the U.S. had restricted the quota for entry, there were no quotas for the Brits. So in their desperation, there were long lines of Jewish visa applicants at almost every consulate. And applicants would, hit 20, 30, 40, 50 consulates before they finally ended up at the Chinese consulate and got visas to a place they never thought they would be going to. So when the line started getting longer and longer, there were people who would line up for days on end. And one survivor says that his father was lined up for 3 days and his mother would bring the father food. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the different uses that my father's off-label visas were good for. One family was that the Haidushkas, and of Hetty and her mother, Margaret, and her father, Fritz. Now, Fritz was one of those who was arrested shortly after the Anschluss of March 1938, and Hetty's mother went to all the different consulates and found and got him a visa, and he was released, and he ended up going to Italy to wait for them. And so a month later, Hetty's mother got them a visa, and the family had a reunion in Italy and boarded a ship, presumably to go to Shanghai. But actually, they did not end up in Shanghai. They ended up in the Philippines, where they weathered the war and then came to the United States. A third use was that in 1938, at the end of 1938 and 1939, there were the illegal Palestine transports. It was the Aliyah Bet. The reason there were these illegal transports was because the Jews who wanted to go to Palestine could not get the limited number of certificates that were being issued by the British who were in charge of Palestine. And the British caved under Arab pressure and basically curtailed the number of Palestine certificates that would allow Jews to emigrate. So there was a movement of these illegal transport ships, mostly filled with teenagers, because at the time the Jewish families wanted to save the next generation. So there were these teenagers put on these ships, rickety ships that they could get wherever they could get, and they would be armed with Shanghai visas, because when they were going through the different ports, they were trying to fool the different countries that they were passing through that they were going to Shanghai, when in reality they were sneaking into Palestine. But I think the greatest use or effect of these Shanghai visas was that it put Shanghai on the map for those Jews who were not in Vienna, who could not come to the consulate to get a visa, but they, through word of mouth and through the American Joint Jewish Distribution Committee, which was working in Austria and Germany and trying to help Jews get out, they heard of Shanghai. Not only that, they heard that you needed no documents to enter Shanghai. So as a result of that, 18,000 Jews ended up in Shanghai from 1938 to 1940 and weathered the Holocaust there. My father was never reunited with any of the people that he had helped. They didn't know his name. They really didn't know who he was. I mean, the people who lined up for the visas, that was just one more process they had to go through in getting out. But I, in doing this research, have had the good fortune to be able to find some of those visa recipients. It's actually very emotional for me to meet them because, you know, my father is now gone, but I feel as if he somehow lives on through them. I told Lottie Marcus, or Lottie Lustig, that my father would be so proud of what she did with her life. She turned her Holocaust experience into helping others. I mean, she turned herself into a humanitarian, you know, and I think that's so meaningful. So when I meet them and get to know them and get to know their histories, I mean, they sort of become family. And I jokingly use the Yiddish word mishpucha to refer to them. You know, they are my mishpucha. I think my father was the right man at the right time to do what he did, because he was a combination of conscientious, courageous, and strategic. I don't think it would have worked as well if one of those elements had been missing.
Thank you very much, Manli, for those thought-provoking and moving remarks. At this point, we'd like to honor you with a Francis Perkins Center Steadfast Award for your creative and thorough pursuit of the people who owe their very existence to the principled work of your father, and for the friendships you've developed with this international group of descendants who consider you family. Thank you so much, Manli. Our next keynote speaker is Dr. Badami Zucker, who is a distinguished professor emerita of U.S. history at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. She holds both a law degree as well as a PhD in American legal history. She's the preeminent authority on Francis Perkins's experience in overseeing the Bureau of Immigration and Naturalization from 1937 to 1940, an aspect of Francis Perkins's legacy that's not as well known as perhaps her work on Social Security and other labor policies. With that, I'd like to show you the video of our interview and the remarks from Dr. Zucker, who gave them to us also a week ago in Tel Aviv. Thank you.
Okay, I'm very excited. And I want to thank you all for the opportunity to express my admiration to a woman who single-handed stood fast against a male-governed cabinet for what she believed to be morally just. Let's take her own words. She said, "When it involves human lives, there can be no delay." And indeed, she followed her conscience during those difficult times when the country was facing an enormous economic crisis, vast unemployment, Nazi aggressive threats to the free world, and a war in the horizon. Now, Frances Perkins spent much of her life shattering the glass ceiling for women. She fought to gain admission to the almost all-male Worcester Classical High School. She successfully battled in court to keep her maiden name after she married. She was New York State First Commissioner of Labor. She was the first woman, what's most important, she was the first woman to serve in an American president cabinet, and as Secretary of Labor, she was one of the only two members who served in Franklin Delano Roosevelt cabinet throughout the entire 12 years in the White House. She was also the most outspoken and persistent advocate for Jewish refugees within the FDR's cabinet. It was a very, very difficult time in the United States. It was, you know, that in 1930s, there were in America 131 institutions who legally presented themselves as anti-Semite. Can you imagine? During the 1930s, Perkins waged 4 battles to make it possible for more German Jewish refugees to enter the U.S. Perkins' first effort concerned the likely to become a public charge, or as it is usually called, the LPC provision of United States immigration policy. Initiated by President Hoover administration and maintained by the Roosevelt administration, the LPC clause enabled consuls in Europe arbitrarily to reject visa applicants based on their personal assessment as to whether the applicant could support himself. In practice, it became the primary administrative obstacle to approve a visa. Perkins turned for assistance to Harvard Law professor and president advisor Felix Frankfurter, soon to become Supreme Court Justice. At Perkins' suggestion, Frankfurter drafted 2 presidential executive orders to combat the LPC problem. One would have instructed consuls to set aside the LPC requirement in cases of applicants who were target of religious or racial persecution. Fearing the president might not be willing to go that far, Frankfurter also drew an alternative executive order, which would maintain the LPC criterion in all cases, but order the consuls to give priority to victims of religious or social persecution. Perkins raised her proposal at an April 18, 1933 cabinet meeting. The State Department strongly objected, and the president sided with state. Her second initiative was to permit American citizens to post a bond in advance of the immigrants' arrival in the United States as a guarantee that the potential immigrant would not become a public charge. This set off a battle between the two departments. Again, the State Department strongly opposed the proposal, contending that the consuls did not have a legal right to accept a bond before deciding on whether to grant a visa. Senior State Department officials, such as the Visa Division Paul Fletcher, worried that the bond procedure would enable Jewish aliens to flood into the United States. He warned, if ships begin to arrive in New York City laden with Jewish immigrants, the predominant gentle population of the country will claim that they have been betrayed through a sleeping State Department. The main legal question raised was whether the bonding procedure would function only after arrival at U.S. ports with an immigration visa, as the state had argued, or if it could be done before the consul abroad reached his conclusions. It should be really emphasized that the section, which is very important, that the section in the immigration law did not expressly state that an alien must be at America's shores before the Secretary of Labor could take action. Taken at face value, the statute seemed to allow the Secretary of Labor to act before the alien arrived. Moreover, the Department of Labor regulation applicable to that section provided that after such bond had been posted, Labor may, in its discretion, authorize the admission of such aliens. Nevertheless, State refused to accept such interpretation. It held fast to the policy that the law did not permit the consuls abroad to accept a bond before granting a visa. In September 1937, Visa Division Chief asserted that no alien immigrant may be admitted at the U.S. port of entry without having previously obtained a consular immigration visa. And unfortunately, consuls in Europe continue to follow the strict existing procedures. In 1938, things got really terrible in Germany. And in November 1938, there was the Night of the Broken Glasses, or the name in German is Kristallnacht, where Jews realized for maybe the first time that they have to get out. And the atrocities which were then shown got to the West. And the American newspaper gave space for everything. And it was time for something to be done by the President of the United States. The whole problem was the definition of refugee. They didn't want to include refugee in their immigration policy. Didn't want. They say that there is no refugee. There is only an applicant for immigration. And that's was the core of the problem. So Perkins raised the idea to issue large numbers of visitors' visas in lay off visa applications to people who otherwise would be denied because they were unable to satisfy the requirements of proving they would safely return to Germany after 6 months. Assistant Secretary Messerschmidt was terrified when he heard about this, and he called the proposal, and I quote, a loophole in the law that would be contrary to the spirit of our immigration law. And he contended that it, again, I quote, would have the effect of breaking down our whole immigration practice. He became increasingly concerned that Perkins and that he called Perkins' proposal hysterical, and this is a proposal of an hysteric woman. He personally called Perkins on phone, and by the way, people who were standing there at his office describe the high voices that they heard. He actually shouted at her, and he pressed her to drop her what he called illegal proposal. But despite the state's strong objection, FDR announced at a press conference on 18 November 1938 to extend visitor visas to German Jewish visitors already in the United States. The president saw the advantage in accepting her suggestion because they were already in the United States. It would help him to show that he is that he is considering and he is very sad for what is going on in Germany on one hand, and on the other hand, it won't let in any more immigrants, so no one will enter. People are already there in the United States. If the visas were not extended, the administration would find itself in an awful position of having to forcibly deport thousands of stateless Jews to Nazi Germany, undertaking what even the president acknowledged would be, and I quote again, cruel and inhuman mass deportation. And especially, and this is also important, it was a year of an election, and that clearly would have made a political sense. Though the precise total number of German Jews admitted on visitors' visas between 1933 and 1940 is not known, a reasonable estimate would be 20 to 30,000. Much larger numbers of refugees, no doubt, would have been granted if any of Perkins' other proposal had been adopted, but at least this she could do, and there is no doubt that many thousands lives were saved. Now let me tell you something about Frances Perkins. She was an exception to the indifference and often patronizing attitude within government circles toward the suffering of Jewish refugees. Also, Perkins was overwhelmed by the country's many economic problems, including unemployment and the need to initiate and advance social programs for workers, she never forsook her humanitarian credo. Despite a constant barrage of criticism from cabinet members, she stood for her beliefs. The House Judiciary Committee even considered impeaching her, although its investigation ultimately found, I quote, a lack of any evidence to evade responsibility to enforce the law, or of failure or neglecting or refusing to enforce the law against any alien. A congressional effort in 1940 to reorganize the Department of Labor was motivated by hostility toward Perkins. She had to endure attacks for using her maiden name or the title Madam. She was even accused of fabricating her genealogy by the American Vigilance Intelligence Federation, which in 1935 accused her of fraud, that she was really Jewish and had been born Matilda Vatsky, and she was adopted. Journalists went all over the places where she studied. They looked for certificate, for birth certificate, for marriage certificate, school record, medical record, among other things. But the real Frances Perkins, the one that I saw, was an extraordinary, kind, and generous person who stood up valiantly against the forces of nativist restriction and anti-Semitism, symbolizing traditional American values as she fought a lonely fight in the cabinet and behind on behalf of refugees from Hitler, a ray of light in the deep darkness engulfing the victims of Nazi Germany. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Zucker, for your profound remarks that are so thought-provoking and fascinating. We honor Dr. Zucker also with the Steadfast Award for her diligence in researching and documenting a disturbing period in American history in hopes that it would not repeat itself. We had really hoped to present it to her in person, but we say to her next year in Newcastle. Thank you very much. The next portion of our program will be moderated, as we said, by Judy Goldstein. She is a member of the Frances Perkins Center Board. She's a historian. She's from New York City, although we know that she loves to spend time in Maine as well. She's an author. She's the founder and executive director of Humanity in Action, whose 2,500 past and present fellows make up a vibrant international community committed to social justice around the world. She also had the privilege of meeting Frances Perkins when their lives intersected when she was a student at Cornell University and Frances Perkins was a faculty member. Judy and her colleague, Hannah Sachs, will direct your questions to our keynoters, and ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Judith Goldstein.
My thanks to the Frances Perkins Center for the opportunity to engage in this special event. It confronts us with issues of historical importance and contemporary meaning. Today, we continue to face enormous issues about immigration, visas, laws, and pluralistic societies. Manli Ho has told us that she thinks her father was the right man at the right time to do the right thing. He was, she said, a combination of conscientious, courageous, and strategic. I think these words describe both Dr. Ho and Madam Perkins. The narratives of these two people who went against the policies of their countries, those narratives don't intersect. But they were both subject to a set of traumatic global forces. The expansion of Germany and Japan in the 1930s and 40s, the rush for Jews to escape Europe, and the refusal of so many countries to accept Jewish refugees, made so clear after the July 1938 Evian conference. No countries really wanted these refugees. In this conversation, there are three cities of importance as presented to us: Vienna, Shanghai, and Washington, D.C. Let me give just a very quick background to the three. Vienna had the third largest Jewish population in Europe, in European cities, 167,000 Jews in 1935. In 1938, with the Anschluss and the imposition of the Nuremberg laws, the Nazis dissolved Jewish organizations and institutions. They wanted Jews to emigrate, and their plan succeeded. By the end of 1941, 130,000 Jews had left Vienna, 30 of whom went to the United States. Those who remained were mostly sent to the camps. Jews who had been citizens and protected by the state were turned into refugees. The laws turned against them. Now, Shanghai, the greatest port in China, had its own Jewish population. In the early 20th century, there were 1,000 Jews. The number grew to approximately 25,000 after the influx of Jews from the Russian Revolution and then the Nazis' policies of forced immigration, which Manli has spoken about. And then there's Washington, the seat of American power, which allowed little entry for Jews fleeing Europe. A combination of really stringent exclusionary laws passed by the Congress in the 1920s and policies practiced by the State Department in the late 30s and 40s made Jewish immigration almost impossible into the States. One final point I'd like to make, and that is that after the Anschluss, Madam Perkins was able to convince Roosevelt to combine the U.S. immigration quotas for Germany and Austria to give a greater opportunity for Austrian Jews. The State Department could then issue a maximum of 27,000 visas per year for immigrants born in those countries. But by June 1938, just to give you an example of what couldn't be done, there were nearly 140,000 people on the German quota list waiting for U.S. immigration visas. So now may I ask a few questions to Manli Ho, and is Professor Zucker with us? Or Manli Ho, let me ask one thing. What do you think were the major influences that provided the moral and religious core for his actions?
My father was born during a time in China, as I said, where East and West, and it was not ever, along with the imperialist powers, came the religion, the missionaries. And my father was a product of the missionaries who came to his rural hometown in China, in Hunan, China, the Norwegian Missionary Society. And he lost his own father at age 7. And so he and his mother and sister were taken in by the Norwegian Missionary Society. Now, the Norwegians, unlike some other religions, were not terribly evangelical. What they did was good works. So they built schools, they built a hospital, They built an orphanage, and in 1901, very progressive, they built a vocational school for the deaf and the blind. So my father was educated in the missionary schools, and then later on, he was such a great, brilliant student, studied at the College of Yale in China, which was set up by Yale, by the Yale China Association, in what they defined as it was in fact, a sort of along those military missionary impulses. You know, Harvard and Yale, and all these big schools were establishing branches in China. And my father went to the College of Yale in China, and subsequently got a scholarship to get his PhD at the University of Munich, where he actually saw the rise of Adolf Hitler. So he was very aware of what Hitler was all about by the time he was posted in Vienna. So I would say that his impulse was a combination of Judeo-Christian ethics and Confucian ethics. So he was sort of a blend of the best, I think, of two cultures.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. Let me ask you a few more questions. When your father went to Vienna first in the legation, and then he became the consul general, did he develop friendships with Jews? And is it because of those friendships that he saw how vulnerable they were?
I don't think it was just because of those friendships. Of course, he developed friendships with Jews because, you know, Vienna at the time was an artistic and intellectual hub. And, you know, Sigmund Freud was there, a lot of the Jewish intelligentsia, the Jewish, academics, and high society was there. And so my father had a complete command of German, and he was essentially the face of the Chinese legation. So part of his diplomatic duty was to socialize and to get to know the local population and the local people. And so he had many friends who were Jews.
When your father went back to China, did he face any kind of repercussions for having defied the Chinese policy?
He was first he was demoted. He had angered his ambassador, so he was demoted at first for some other pretext, and he then subsequently left Vienna and went to the U.S. because basically he was not welcomed back to the foreign ministry immediately. So he actually did not return to the Chinese foreign ministry until 1943 or 44. So in the interim, he actually became attached to a Chinese military commission that was posted in the US, and who wanted him because of his strategic abilities.
Quite amazing. I know that Professor Zucker is not on the call, but had she been on it, I would have asked her about what drew her attention to Frances Perkins. In an interview that she did, which was not included in what you saw, she answered, so I'm going to answer in her own words. She said that I was writing a book about American immigration policy in the 1930s, and you know that I come from law, and suddenly with all this darkness by the American sides, by the American consuls, I found two women, one Jewish and one not Jewish, and they both work from the same heart and for the same purpose. So I think those are extraordinary insights into into the reason that Perkins was such a commanding figure for Professor Zucker. So Hannah, shall we turn it over to questions and comments from the people in the audience?
Yes, of course. So we have one question for Manli, and could you please elaborate on why Shanghai was unmanned and people were able to enter that port during that time in history?
Shanghai was an anomaly because after the Japanese invasion of 1937, the Japanese ousted the Chinese government from there, which included the Chinese harbor authorities. Now, unlike the other ports that they took over, Shanghai was a semi-colonialized city and there were other foreign powers there. So the other foreign powers did not want the Japanese to take over the harbor because it would be inconvenient for them. So that meant that the harbor was left completely unmanned. There was no immigration, there was no passport control, there was nothing. So anybody could just pull up, land on a ship and get off. No passport, no documents, nothing required. And that is what my father took advantage of. And that became the only access point to China that he could provide. And by doing so, it alerted not only the Jews in Vienna, but also the Jews in Germany who had no access to his visas, that there was this place in China where they could go. No papers, no questions asked. And that's how essentially he created this refuge in China.
Can you tell us what happens in Shanghai as the war progresses, as the Jewish community grows, and then the Japanese become even a more powerful occupying force?
The Jews, most of the Jewish refugees landed in 1939 and almost very few in 1940. But the majority of them landed in 1939. There were some who left at the end of 38. So when they first got there, many of them, about half the Jewish refugees, ended up in the international concessions. In other words, there was the French concession with the French, the international settlement, which were the Brits and the Americans, and a lot of these Jews ended up finding places to live in the French concession in the international settlement. Now, after Pearl Harbor and the Axis Alliance was formed, the Japanese decided that these Jews were stateless. They were stateless people, and what were they going to do with them? You know, their worldview was stability, and therefore they decided that the best way to maintain stability with these stateless people was basically to push them into the poor Chinese part of the city, which was called Hangqiu, where they were already overcrowded with 100,000 Chinese, some of them refugees from other places in China. So that's what happened. So they pushed all the Jews and basically doubled the population in the Hangqiu area, and they created this settlement for stateless refugees. Now, they put a Japanese guard in charge. He called himself the King of Jews. His name was Goya. And so the Jews who had to leave the ghetto in order to work had to basically pass through him. And he was a bit, my survivors like to say he was a little crazy because he was very short. And, you know, if you were a tall man, what he liked to do was he liked to step up on a stool and slap you because, you know, you looked at him. So that's what happened. So from 1941 on, the Jewish refugees, the stateless Jewish refugees, were kept in this essentially ghetto in Hankyu.
Right. Thank you. Hannah, are there other questions, or shall
Yes.
we move back? Yes,
Yes,
please.
there are. So again, for Manli, could you talk more about some of the individuals who you met, some of the survivors, and just share part of their stories? And then a second question to you is, could you talk a little bit more about what happened to your father after his heroic efforts?
I'll tell you, there are many stories that I have been able to gather. There's the story of Eric Goldstab, who was 17 years old, and he very smartly, after the Anschluss, decided that maybe it was time for them to leave. So he hit 50 consulates before he ended up at the Chinese consulate. And he liked to say, you know, it was to a place that he never dreamed of going. I mean, most Western European Jews, Western Europeans had no idea of China. I mean, China was this, you know, faraway place on the other side of the earth, and much less, you know, Shanghai. So he went in, he said, and he met, I don't know whether it was my father or the vice consul, and he was asked, how many visas do you want? And he said, he decided to include his extended family. So he said 20. And he ended up with 20 visas. And luckily, on Kristallnacht, he and his father were arrested. And because he could produce these visas as proof of immigration, they were released, and they ended up going to the Shanghai on a ship. And in my video, that picture of the people on a ship, passengers on the ship, Conte Biancamano, was taken by Eric Goldstadt. Another survivor is my dear friend Lottie Lustig Marcus. And when the Anschluss happened, Lottie, like my father and some of the other survivors, actually witnessed Hitler marching in triumph into Vienna in March of 1938. And her family, like all the other Jews, tried desperately to find a place to go. Her father happened to be told by somebody else that there's a long line at the Chinese consulate, but you can go there. And so he went, lined up, got a visa, came home and announced that they were going to Shanghai. And Lottie's mother was horrified and said, China, isn't that where they kill people? Anyway, they ended up in Shanghai, and they actually moved to the Chinese section. And Lottie's father, unfortunately, died of kidney cancer and Lottie, at the age of 14, had to help. So she went to work to support the family. You know, you know, I can go on, but there are many others. There were people who lined up for days in front of the Chinese consulate to get these visas. And I remember Kurt Malkischer said his mother would go and bring food to his father because he didn't want to lose his place in line. You know, there were others. There was another survivor who saw the long line and was despairing over how long it would take. He saw my father's car pull up to the consulate gate, and he threw his application papers through the car window. And a few days later, he got a phone call saying, come get your visas. Now, as to what happened to my father afterwards, I think I mentioned that he was not welcome, that he was transferred out. He was not welcome back to the foreign ministry. He ended up actually in Brooklyn, New York, and he worked for the military commission until 1944. But there's a black mark in his personnel records for what he did. Later on, he continued his diplomatic career with the Chinese nationalist government, which later fled to Taiwan. But the denouement of his career was actually not good because he was smeared and impeached, not for I'm not really for issuing visas in Vienna, but for some other reason, mostly that he was he was not a good bureaucrat. Let's put it that way. You know, diplomats are bureaucrats. You know, there's a chain of command. And the Chinese invented bureaucracy, especially. And if you don't toady up to your superior, et cetera, you're not a good bureaucrat. And sooner or later, it's going to get you into trouble. And that's what happened with my father.
Hannah, do we have any more questions? And Sarah, do we have any more time?
Yes, we do have some more time. And I would just like to add that I have been deputized by Batami to answer some questions on her behalf. But I would also like to add that we have an extensive bibliography that includes some really excellent articles and books that she and also that Manli wrote that you will see on our website. And you can download that later if you want to expand on certain things. But there are many parallels between the work of these two people, which is why they came together in our minds as appropriate people to recognize in this conversation. And I would just highlight that Francis Perkins, the attempt to impeach Francis Perkins was a serious blow. And the authority for the Immigration Service was actually removed from the Department of Labor, but not turned over fully to the State Department. Many of the authorities were sent to the Department of Justice, which was a partial vindication of what Perkins had advocated for. But I would really urge people to read both the book that Dr. Zucker wrote and especially the article, particularly on Francis Perkins, that's on the bibliography and also on our website. But Manli can have the last word and the rest of the questions. I know there are plenty more.
Sarah, you think a lot about Perkins and know a lot about her. Do you think because she was the only woman and treated badly often, certainly with disrespect by many of the men, do you think somehow she identified with the Jews as being vulnerable and outsiders?
I think partially, but I think you should also look at her expertise and her experience as a social worker and listening to and feeling very strongly about people through no fault of their own, had a very hard life. But another interesting thing that we've learned through through one of our other board members, and he may be on the call now, Charles Wazansky, who is the son of Francis Perkins's very beloved and dear solicitor at the Department of Labor, that she had a number of Jewish friends and close colleagues, that she had a particular affinity to Jewish people, which was something that he noticed and that his father noticed. So she was a complicated person. There are many aspects of this, and why we continue to be so interested in learning more about her, because these questions are hard to answer. I suspect that there is an element, sure, when you see those photographs of her literally being the only woman with all of those guys, and being told that her remarks, her humanitarian statements, were those of a hysterical woman. It doesn't go down well.
Would she have answered that those interests were the product of a religious woman, a very strong Episcopalian?
Possibly. But again, her faith was tremendously important to her, but she never spoke about it, or she rarely spoke about it publicly. So again, teasing out these stories it's very difficult. It's one of the reasons that there isn't more scholarship about her. But I suspect you're definitely on to something. Again, it's one of the reasons that she changed her denomination from Congregationalist to Episcopalian, because she felt that there were more, that the Episcopal Church was more aligned with her very deep-seated beliefs in the social gospel and so on. Again, there's some excellent readings on this that you can find out more about. But it's something that they certainly seem to have had in common. But what we always wonder is whether their paths ever crossed, whether they knew each other. Perkins, that one of the photographs that you saw was a picture of her with the other experts who were preparing for the Evian conference in 1938. She was one of the people who did the briefing materials for that. I believe she was there, but she was not a member of the formal delegation. I had a question for Manli, which is why China was not part of the Evian conference with 32 nations. Is that something that you could illuminate for us?
The Evian conference essentially was a conference of Western nations. And okay. China at that time was already under Japanese occupation.
Mm-hmm. So they weren't invited, in other words.
This was a Western problem that the West could not solve.
I mean, nobody wanted to go to China. It was under Japanese occupation. I mean, nobody even thought of China. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the reasons, I'm sure. The other thing I wanted to add a little bit, that I would not be surprised if my father had not at least run into or seen or met Roosevelt's cabinet members, because he was posted, as I said, to the Chinese Military Commission, which was in Washington, D.C. And he talked about seeing Roosevelt, how Roosevelt was actually, when they stood him up he wasn't on crutches, but when they stood him up, he was very tall, despite his handicap.
Again, there's so many questions and one of the purposes in our minds of holding this forum is that we really hope that more scholars and more researchers will follow some of these leads, and we'd like to hear what they're learning, because this is an ongoing study.
Hannah, there are more questions?
Yes. Well, a question for both Manli and Judy, and I guess Sarah, if you'd like to jump in as well, It's what parallels do you see between restrictive immigration policies in the 1930s and 40s and today in the US or in other nations as well? So that's for all three of you, really. Maybe we can start with Manli.
What happens when there are restrictive immigration policies is, I'll give you an example of US immigration policy as it applied to what happened in Vienna in 1938. My father said that most of the Jews wanted to come to the US. That was the desired destination. But first of all, the Austrian quota had been filled, and US immigration policy was really very stringent. That's an exact quote. And therefore, even people, it required financial sponsorship, and even people who got it had to wait. Well, events like Kristallnacht did not wait. So what happened with my father was that his Shanghai visa scheme managed to fill the gaps so that people who were waiting for their US immigration papers to come through ended up applying for Shanghai visas in order to get out of concentration camp, in order to be able to leave and somehow hopscotch their way to the US. My father, in fact, said that his visas were to Shanghai in name only, and it was really a way to help people get out and find their way to a preferred destination, all on the pretext of going to Shanghai. So I can tell you a lot of stories about how some of the survivors used these visas to hopscotch to where they finally wanted to end up. They would be able to get transit visas through other countries with Shanghai as a destination. And once they got there, they found a way to get to where they wanted to go. So one example is Arthur Kurteman, who got out of Dachau on a Shanghai visa. He made his way to London, where he didn't go to Shanghai. He went to the US Embassy and said, I want to apply for immigration to the US. And he got here because the US had no quota for Brits. So
There's a very long and not very pretty story about Americans being suspicious of immigration, particularly in the 20th century, from Eastern Europe and from Southern Europe, and from other parts of what was considered the undesirable world. And all of this comes to a climax in 1924, when the Congress passes a very restrictive immigration law, which is the quota system. And essentially, what they do is they look back to 1890 and take a profile of the population, which was overwhelmingly Western European, Anglo-Saxon, Christian, and said that's the kind of population we want to continue to be, and to accept people who want to come to this country, and others are not going to be welcome. And in fact, we had closed immigration, and Chinese immigration had been prohibited in the 1880s, Japanese immigration essentially the early 20th century. We do not have an open and an immigration policy that meets the aspirations of American life. We don't have an open immigration policy again until 1965. The connection to today is that it's taken all these years from 1965 until today to increase immigration to the country that heralds it, and for the pushback to take place. So what we're seeing today is extremely close to what occurred at the turn of the 20th century and resulted in very, very restrictive laws. Jews were shut out, Italians were shut out, Slavs were shut out, of course, blacks were shut out. It was very clear this was a country for white Anglo-Saxons only.
And Dr. Zucker also emphasizes, she writes a lot about the likely to be a public charge, the LPC rule that is very much in the news today. And another emphasis that she makes is how much is not defined so much in law, but in the administration of it. In other words, that the bureaucracy that administers these laws develops its own policies, often in out of sync with the desires of the American public. I've been given a warning that we have just a couple minutes. Is there one more question, or should we be doing our closing comments before they turn us off? Hannah, one more quick one?
Sure.
Or
One
most
quick
of the
question. Yeah, one quick question. You both touched upon the ways that Dr. Ho and Frances Perkins were vilified, but in their later years, were they celebrated and recognized, or did that really come after their passing?
I'll just say quickly, it took a long time for Frances Perkins to be recognized, and maybe not celebrated until right now. So, or a little bit more recently, but Manli?
My father's history was completely, would have been lost. And so, it's taken me 20 years to uncover it. And he was honored by Yad Vashem as a righteous among the nations posthumously. It was 3 years after he died.
And it would not have happened but for your work, and we applaud you for that. I think I'm getting the word that we do need to close out, and we are very, very grateful to our speakers and to our participants, and especially, of course, to our sponsors and co-presenters who publicize this program, and to Jeff Parker and his technical crew. I did mention, and you do know to look for the bibliography that's on our website at francisperkinscenter.org, because there's way more to learn. Our session was recorded, and it will be available as soon as we can put it up on the website. And we hope that you'll stay with us and save the date for our next virtual program that will be August 15th, when we'll honor our yet to be announced recipients of this year's Frances Perkins Center Open Door and Intelligence and Courage Awards. And there's still time to send in nominations. And we thank everyone for this very robust and meaningful discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.